Hello everybody, during this video I'll be going through with you what exactly are trend lines, how to use them, and how to draw them correctly. So a trend line is essentially connecting points on a chart as something like this. So we are currently on an uptrend, as you can see on this chart right here. So you can see price making higher highs and higher lows, as you can see here continuing a trend. So a trend can be seen as this, so making higher highs, higher lows, etc. So you can see very clearly that this is an uptrend, and a trend line is connecting in an uptrend the lowest points that the price reached, so the higher lows of an uptrend, and vice versa if you're going on a downtrend, the lower highs, and I'll be going through that in a bit. So we can see here that I've connected each week as best as I could onto the trend uh, on my trend line. You can see that some of the weeks are outside of the trend, so you can see that they kind of cut through the trend line and then jump back in it, and this happens a lot, and very frequently you'll find that trend lines are not perfect and you won't be able to always have the edge essentially of the week onto the trend line. So you sometimes the wicks will cut through the trend line and then go back up, or just carry on depending on where the price wants to go. So what I usually do when drawing trend lines is try to get as many point hits as I can. So I'll try to match as many points where price has reached to my trend line and make it into a fine line. And it's important to note that I'm not forcing this, so I'm not going to force a trend line if there is not one. So if I were to go, let's say here, you can see that this downtrend here is not as easily noticeable with a trend line, so you won't be able to do something like this. You might be able to get some of it, so you can see that if I were to try and match this high here, I won't be able to match the previous one, so it's not going to be perfect when drawing your trend lines. So what I will suggest doing is try to include as many points as possible. You can maybe do something like this in this case, but you can see it's not perfect, and I wouldn't consider this a valid trend line in my honest opinion. So I usually, if I were to include it in my reasons why I will enter a trade, I will only look for valid trend lines that look something like this, and it's easily noticeable from everybody without actually knowing much about trend lines. So you can see, without even realizing this is a trend line, without trading trend lines, you can see that this is easily a trend line which is followed along through the trend. So that is one thing to keep in mind. Never force trend lines. So this is an example on an uptrend. I'll show you an example of a downtrend. So this is an example of how a downtrend trend line might look like. So you can see that the price is going on a downtrend. It's making lower highs and lower lows, and in this case I'm connecting the highest points of the trend line. So it started from here, reached this point, and then retraced and continued a run downwards. And you can see it, when it retraced back onto the trend line, it actually tried to stop. You can see the red candles right there, but then broke through, and then after a while went back in, retested, and continue the downtrend. So you can see most of the time your trend lines might be breaking, so you have price breaking through in some instances. It doesn't mean that this trend line is invalid. It's not perfect, but it's still a trend line. And one thing about trend lines, similar to support and resistance zones, the more hits the trend line has, the stronger it is. So keep that in mind when trading trend lines. So this one has, let's say, 1, 2, 3, 4. It's an okay trend line, but usually anything above 5 is considered a strong trend line. And in my opinion, for it to be considered a trend line, it needs to at least have 3 hits. Some people say to you, I prefer having 3 to consider it a valid trend line, but obviously you can draw a line between 2 points. So the minimum to have a trend line is 2 points. My criteria has a third one, it all depends on the trader. So you'll see how you feel about this, because obviously you can connect any two highs or lows and make a trend line. That doesn't mean that it's a valid trend line that will be um, respected like a support or resistance zone. So keep that in mind when drawing trend lines. And another thing about what I see people ask a lot is, should I include the wicks? So what I usually respond to that is, you can include the wicks. The important thing is to get as many hits as possible. So I usually include the wicks, because keep in mind that this might haven't closed up to that point, but it reached that point. So at some point in time, that was a full candle. So it reached that point, went back downwards, but keep that in mind that it at some point it reached that price, and at that point it was a full candle and not a wick. So that is my thinking about this. Some people say otherwise. I think including wicks is a reasonable thing to do. So you can see in this example right here, if the price wicked onto the trend line and rejected instantly and dropped downwards. So you can see the wick was included in this when drawing the trend line. And another thing is when people are trading trend lines, the trend line can be used on the other side. So you can see the price broke through in this instance here, and then retested the trend line right here, and then jumped off to the other side. So it used the backside of the trend line to be as a zone or a support zone to be moving upwards. So keep that in mind about trend lines. They can be used on both sides and not just one side. So that is another thing to keep in mind. And also, before close this video, trend lines can be used, let's say on this downtrend, you could, let's say, draw a line like this on the other side, so marking the lower points of the trend line. And you can use this actually as your take profits. So if you were trading off of this, let's say you sold onto that point, or let's say on that point, you will be targeting right about here. If I was me, I will be targeting, let's say, this point right here, and you can see that it will actually reach it at some point. So it's obviously depending on the trader. Some people like to be more conservative and target the previous lows. I will be at least targeting that. Maybe if I wanted to get a better rewards to risk ratio, I'll be targeting lower points. It all depends on what you're trying to do. So you can draw on either side. It depends on how you feel about this. Some people don't um, draw the underneath or the other side essentially of the trend line, and only use the trend lines as an entry, and that is valid as well. So it all depends on the person. One thing to keep in mind, I wouldn't be trading off of, let's say, this lower trend line right here, because that will be counter trading, and I will avoid that. At least as a beginner, I will avoid doing so. If you are a more advanced trader and you have a strategy based on reversals, you can go for that. But as a beginner, I would never trade off of, let's say, the lower lows in a downturn or the higher highs in an uptrend, because I will be counter trading. I will only take trades that will involve only as going with the trend. So in a downtrend, you will be selling. In an uptrend, you will be buying. So that is one thing to keep in mind. I think I've covered everything that I wanted. Hopefully you've found this video useful. If you did, make sure to like and subscribe on the YouTube channel. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.